Hey guys, welcome back to the Postkahanism Podcast. Today I've got Mr. Dictator's Den on, and we're going to be doing a general discussion of a couple of books, The Arabists and Ike's Gamble, um, and maybe a little bit of Eli Kaduri in there as well, as they relate to the history of America's involvement in the Middle East. Um, so, hello, Mr. Dictator's Den.
How's it going?
Thank God. Cool.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yeah, I can hear you
Okay,
fine.
great. All right, let me
Okay.
know if I start getting silent or just like I'm breaking up or whatever.
I'll let you know. So we're recording. Um, okay, so basically, uh, the two books that inspired this are The Arabists by
Robert
Kaplan,
Kaplan. Yep.
Robert Kaplan, yeah, and a book called Ike's Gamble by Michael Doran, who's actually on Twitter. He's an excellent account to follow, and maybe we'll do a follow-on interview with him. So
So you recommended Ike's Gamble to me. Like I obviously am interested in, the Cold War and this like part of the world and so forth, but that was a really good recommendation. And then I actually remembered I had a copy of The Arabist, having not read it, but I remember you talked about it a while back, and I just ended up reading it, and I was sort of blown away. Like, there's a lot of things Kaplan says that I disagree with, but it is a very, very interesting book, and you sort of see like the nuts and bolts of the State Department in a probably a more honest way than it's usually presented to the world, and I thought that was pretty cool.
So let's for the audience who might not know, what is the Arabists about?
It's about these elite people. They are, in terms of education, they are like pristine, by and large, New England Ivy Leaguers. Some of them come from humble backgrounds, but these are these are high human capital people, um, regardless of what you think of their beliefs. And I don't think much, but they are very intelligent. They were they were raised by other missionaries and diplomats, and the up until like,
Wait. Let's go even let's zoom even further out. So the Arabists starts in the
there are
19th
people who have a
century, right?
fascination with like the Middle East and Arab culture, similar to like Lawrence of Arabia, but they also are, I would say, very liberal, and they believe, what is the term they have, like localitis. I don't. I think some of this has been reeled in a bit in the sense that I don't think they're quite as overt as they were, even if the diplomatic class is still like not aligned, I would say, with how the average American like sees things. But they are, yeah, I would say
Wait,
they're sort
let's
of have like a bubble.
wait. Let's zoom out. So the Arabists starts with American involvement in the Middle East in the 19th century, and at the
Yes.
time, outside of Latin America to some extent with the Monroe Doctrine, U.S. foreign involvement basically ran to trade and missionizing, um,
Yes.
both heavily dominated by the Yankees. And
Yep.
these people, right now, this was right around the time that the Yankees, um, you know, kind of shucked off the last vestiges of Puritanism and became um, more Unitarian or Universalist. So, you know, whereas like the Puritans were like, no, we're actually more Christian than the Catholics. Um,
Right.
the 19th century Yankees eventually were like, okay, Jesus was basically the um, the progressive, right? And it
Yeah.
doesn't matter whether he was divine or not. The main thing is that he preached about the equality of man, the brotherhood of man, and this is the real message of Christianity, and we got to spread that across the world. That and opium, right? Like literal opium. Uh, no, I mean, they had incredible commercial powers. They were
Yes.
incredible traders all over the world. They were great sailors, and they were also missionaries. So
Yeah.
they went to the Middle East and they saw all these poor, primitive, backwards Arab people who obviously could use some education and some Jesus. And they really, many of them gave their lives to living in, living in the Middle East, learning the local languages, including Arabic. The Puritans were always good with languages. I think Yale's initial commencement address was delivered in Hebrew, and it was kind of considered a sign of good upbringing to be able to read Hebrew in right in that milieu. So they learned Arabic, they learned whatever other local languages there were, and they settled down. And they started setting up. Of course, you can't just show up and start talking to people about Jesus. You got to set up things that immediately benefit them. So they set up healthcare programs. They set up education. This is kind of
that was sort of the bait, though. That's the bait that drew the locals, because they're not. I know that they thought they were like, but the locals didn't care about any of this stuff, like the religious stuff. They just cared, like that. Oh, there's a hospital here, or there's a education center, or like a school. Although the locals, a lot of the local leaders did not like this stuff either. They correctly viewed it as like this is like a sort of like antigen or whatever.
Right.
But can I just add something before, like the book that. Sorry, what is going on here? Okay. The book that dovetails nicely with the Arabists, and I actually read it first, and I think I'm almost certain that I found it on some old UR thing from years ago, and it's not even like an old book or it's called Michael Oren's Power, Faith, and Fantasy, and it's about the U.S. in the Middle East, and it's written for mainstream audience. It's very easy to read, and you can find it for like pennies, but he talks about it. Basically is an awesome book until World War II. Then it sort of turns into every other book on the Middle East where that has the same blind spots and stuff. But he talks about like how initially like these we can call them Puritans. Like, I mean, you know what I mean? Like there's like Congregationalists. There's all these things, and they're all we can call them the Yankees. But at first, the first I think real foray of missionary activity in the Middle East was not even to the Arab. It was to the Jews, and it was this is like in 1819. You have, Levi Parsons, Pliny Fisk. They go there, and the impetus for going there was that we want to, because of biblical prophecies, you want to actually help the Jews. They're, I guess, hopefully going to turn Protestant, and by Protestant, like us, and then like literally like, I think heaven on earth. Like it's crazy. They went there to Palestine, and it was like a backwater Ottoman province. It was horrible, disease everywhere, and they had no luck. So there was more. And again, this is like early U.S. history. This is like This is like, I think I looked up. This is like before John Quincy Adams was president, I believe. So this is like very early on. They were doing this. They were there. And they, it took them decades. Like, at one point, I think after the Civil War is when they really got a toehold. But you have this ongoing missionary work for decades there, trying to just, they settled in Beirut, and Kaplan says Beirut was a beautiful city. It sounds like it was. They settled there, and they eventually, this guy, Daniel Bliss, who was a missionary, founded the American University of Beirut. I think it was originally called Syrian Protestant College. Then you have Cyrus Hamlin, who was the cousin of Hannibal Hamlin, who was Lincoln's first VP of Maine. And he makes Robert College, which became an important Turkish mission school. And the local elites often sent their kids there. And, the Americans of these Arab, like these early mission schools, they mixed with the Arab or with the elites in American society at home. So like Ivy Leaguers, titans of industry, philanthropists, they all went there. And as the 19th century drew on, the United States like foreign policy and its missionary policy were like one and the same. Like the United States diplomatic stuff, it was like centered around these mission schools in the Middle East. Like even in World War One, like a reason like Wilson's stance toward the Ottoman Empire, because he was friends with a lot of these missionaries, was dictated on if we push too hard or if we declare war or whatever, we could lose these mission schools. So this wasn't just like an incidental thing. This was like a key pillar of foreign policy in this region.
Right.
And
well, it led foreign policy. It led foreign policy in the sense, and you see this not just in the Middle East. You see this the exact parallel process happening in China, where you have Yankee traders and also Yankee missionaries, and preaching to the locals, race Christians. You know, and you have things like the Taiping Rebellion, which is, you know, ends up killing 50 million people, and
the Boxers were not happy about the missionaries either.
The Boxers were not happy about the missionaries, but by the time the Boxers came around, it was 50 years after the Taiping Rebellion, which killed like 50 million people, and was led by a guy that, you know, had been missionized and decided that actually he was Jesus. Like, you know, why not? But the interesting thing about all this is that these efforts. So, as you alluded to, the Arabs were not interested in converting to Christianity. Especially not 19th century, well, not any kind of Christianity, but not 19th century post-Protestant Christianity.
There was like Nestorians, and there were weird sects. There's like Armenian Orthodox, but they are so different than Protestantism. And they, you know, it's not even, it's sort of like comparing like a Daewoo to like a Daewoo car to like, say, like a diesel, like F-250 or I don't know, like some crazy, it's like, oh, it has four wheel. Like that's like where the similarities.
Right,
you know.
And the Muslims were not interested at all, but what did happen is that these guys were interested in these educational institutions, some of them,
yes,
and also these missionaries, they were kind of the first Arab nationalists in the Middle East.
Yes,
because
they were promoting it.
They kind of invented Arab nationalism in a sense.
Yes.
Because until then, there hadn't really been like an Arab nationalist consciousness, which would say, okay, these Turks are racially alien to us that are ruling the place, and we need to. But for the missionaries, in a sense, it was kind of a different. It was a little bit of like what the British Empire did everywhere, where it promoted nationalists as kind of as proxies to fight the Turks and the Russians. But also it was something that we can get behind. You know, like, hey, you don't like the Turks, we don't like the Turks either. But instead of it just being generic Middle Eastern resentment of your neighbor or the guy ruling you, now here's an ideology. And a lot of the people that jumped on board with this, were, you know, as it rose, were these indigenous Arab Christians.
But Oren talks about, I think that the first, you know, this is, I want to just jump ahead quickly to this and then move back. I just want to do this anecdote, but I think he said that like a lot of the early anti-Zionist stuff in like Palestine was actually done by the Arab Christians, not the Muslims at first, which is kind of interesting because, and as you say, they went to these schools. But I think that like what people don't really get about missionary stuff, or maybe like some people do, is that they think, oh, well, they're missionaries, Christians today, Chick-fil-A, you know, Trump, like Walmart, you know, whatever. They think, oh, this is right wing, but this is not, like, these missionaries are not right wing. This is left wing stuff. This is the reason we have the stuff we have today is because of this, like in the Middle East, this weird missionary stuff. Like basically all of the, like, you know, we're all one people, we're all like a brotherhood and all this stuff. That was underpinned by Christianity, but once the locals didn't accept, like the Christianity didn't work, and you know, eventually American like Protestantism just kept evolving, they just dropped it and they just kept these like basically like libtard institutions and so forth, and they just like, all right, we'll just drop the spiritual stuff and we'll just like, you know, train like future libtards, which is exactly what happened.
Yes,
and people like that was cool with everyone involved, basically.
So 19th century Christianity, the British and the Yankee versions of it were very much a progressive force. I don't know. We can talk about Curtis Yarvin's whole theory that that Protestant Christianity in general was a progressive force, and in fact, I mean, from the Jewish perspective, uh, the original Christians were progs, um, and it's kind of poisoned the well. But whatever. The point is that you had a small but influential social class of people who originally were missionaries, and those people's kids, who sort of went a little bit native,
Yes.
while maintaining very close contact with their parent their parent civilization in New England. Um,
Yeah.
and so what happened after World War II, when America found itself, um, actually, needing to have a foreign policy and intelligence services and all this other stuff in the Middle East, because it had inherited the British Empire and its positions. These people were the subject matter experts. Uh, One example, and I believe he's mentioned the Arabists, is a guy named Eddie King, who was he'd been born and raised in Lebanon. His parents were both missionaries. He spoke fluent Arabic. He served in the Marine Corps in World War One, and during World War II, when it became obvious that you needed to deal with Saudi Arabia, which is this huge place full of oil, which was a very vital resource. So he served as FDR's translator to the Saudi king.
Yeah.
Um, and
On the Bitter Lake or whatever,
uh,
where they met in Bitter Lake to discuss. They were on this like giant like pleasure barge thing, and there was like
yes, yes, exactly. When Abdulaziz met FDR on the Great Bitter Lake in Egypt. So Eddie was a translator, and then after the war, he went on to work in the CIA and the State Department. Um, so the Arabists kind of tracks this class of people, and then how they view the world, and because they were the subject matter experts on this entire area, um, how they viewed the world and how they viewed the Middle East is in large part the way that the State Department, the CIA viewed the Middle East, to a large extent the way that the New York Times viewed the Middle East. These guys, just by virtue of growing up here, were the experts, and their views were kind of presented as default objective, right?
I think too, like just to hammer it home because we've kind of said some stuff that is crazy. Like if you're just uninitiated to this, like it is weird. I did not realize the extent of the meddling, like just back in 1819, even, but it's been going on for a long time, and I think like a couple things, like the British Empire was a giant like whale, and maybe like you could say America's like global influence in the 19th century, even in parts of like maybe even the early 20th century was like so small in comparison. So the way that locals often viewed like the British, for instance, as just this sinister, thing, like, oh well, they're evil, imperialist, whereas America was meddling in stuff with and setting up these schools, but because they did not have the power that the British Empire had, and Kaplan kind of talks about this, they sort of flew a little bit under the radar. So like they're like, oh well, you guys are doing good stuff because you're teaching people how to read, but these evil British are doing all this stuff. But really, they're both meddling, and there was a thing. I do want to talk about the Armenians at one point, but there was a thing where Teddy Roosevelt went to Cairo on some trip. This is after he's out of the presidency, and there was unrest in Egypt, which is being administered by the British. It sort of changed some hands. Like, I don't know. But anyway, the locals were pissed off, and there was these protests. I think they assassinated the prime minister, and so Teddy Roosevelt goes there and he says, like, listen, you guys are out of control right now, but the British should just go ahead and should keep running Egypt for now while you guys are so unruly. And then the locals hated him, obviously. They're like, you are an imperialist scum, and he talks to some other guys like, man, these locals are really, really mean. Like, why are they just acting so rowdy? And then, like, Orrin points out that the leaders of this like stupid rebellion or whatever were like they were trained. A lot of them were trained at these missionary schools. So like when you have one guy from America who represents the face of America, or did when he was president, he's there and he's mad about this unrest happening, and then it's actually caused by another part of America, these mission schools. Like the same thing with the Young Turks. Like a lot of them went to Robert College, and it's just kind of funny how you see it as this innocuous thing, but it's really completely sinister. And in fact, it's sinister in the sense that it just causes all this like chaos and death and stuff, but it's like it's hard to identify that it's the source. Like I'm sure it was easier if you're living there at the time, you're like, wow, all these people are going to this place, but it doesn't look the same as like, like the sort of like Noam Chomsky boilerplate, like we're just going to invade Iraq for oil. It's like they're doing a different, more insidious kind of actual, like, I guess you can call it imperialism, but does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I mean, for some context, the 19th century, this was kind of the thing to do. 19th century, like you had the Russian Empire, which would use the Orthodox Christian populations living under non-Orthodox Christian rule as sort of a pretext for influence operations and eventually going to war. You had the British, who supported nationalist movements in
everywhere
Greece,
they could.
Everywhere they could, as long as they could.
Bulgaria.
Bulgaria, but also the Caucasus. A big part of the 19th century is the British supporting Muslim rebels in the Caucasus, the Cherkess and everything else, the Circassians against the Russian Empire. So the French also, used the Maronites as kind of a foothold in Lebanon. Yes. We're here to protect these people's rights, and they're our fellow Catholics and so forth. And so this was sort of part of the game. The difference, I guess, is that America, as you alluded to, it didn't have at this time a military that could project sustained force into the Middle East. And so it was all soft power for 100 years until American hard power showed up to the area.
There's another book that I know you're a fan of, that Ellie Kadori, the Chatham House version, which I don't know, that might have also been on UR at some point. There's an essay in there called Minorities, and he's talking about how people in the third world, as we call it today or whatever, don't like the West. But the things they don't like about the West are like, it's like you could dislike stuff that the West does, but the stuff that they think that the West does is not like even the bad stuff. The bad stuff it does is often overlooked because the people in the third world have that same ideology. So for instance, in Armenia, which is, being run by the Ottomans, it's not a country at this point. The Armenians are spread out. They have not had any experience ruling. This is in the 19th century now. So they do enjoy certain privileges, like the Ottomans let their religious Orthodox leaders run their society as they see fit. I mean, they have to pay taxes and stuff. But the point I'm making is that, basically these American missionaries came and they got some of the Armenians to accept Protestantism. And this obviously caused a big problem. The Armenian local leaders like, this is going to mess up our society. And okay, so that happened. They lost some people. But then, because of the influence of the Protestant Armenians, now the religious, Orthodox Armenian community split into a more reactionary old school one and a reform one. So of course, the reform one basically eventually wins. And then the sort of idea of this, by the way, is that if you look at just the idea of Americanism, it is, well, if I don't agree with this rule, I'm going to change it. What is it called? The Quakers call it the inner light. This goes back to the American Revolution. It's I don't like this rule, so I'm going to change it. It doesn't apply to me. And you think, well, that's all well and good if it's tyranny, but what happens if it's that's kind of the ideology of the people we have in our society today. It's what happens if, it's someone that's kind of alien from you that thinks this. So it's kind of a slippery slope. And the Armenians, they're well, this old religion that we had is wrong. Maybe some other stuff is wrong too. This is American as apple pie, where they're just like, well, we don't like these Ottoman people ruling over us, and so now we are going to form our own nationalist movement. And they kind of know how it works. You need a great power. So the Ottomans don't like this at all. They don't like the reform stuff. They liked it at first, but they realized, like, hey, this is going to just undermine us. Like, is Russia going to let these Armenians form this, like, nation here? Is it going to, like, there's all sorts of reasons why the great powers wouldn't want this. And it's like the Armenians don't really understand this, though, because they just saw it worked in other places. So they're like doing stuff deliberately to provoke the like Ottomans into killing them. And then they're saying, look, liberal Western powers, can you like help us? But like the British couldn't help the Armenians at this time. I think it's based on like its geography, and the Russians were sort of playing both sides. But basically, you had these people, I think, like, what is it, the Troja, the Hunjaks, who were just doing stuff like very like Sinn Féin stuff, like killing people, like collaborators they felt, just doing like terrorist stuff, like doing, spreading pamphlets. And the Ottomans are like, they don't like this, obviously. I'm not a huge fan of the Ottoman Empire, but it also seems weird that they just basically started this giant sectarian bloodbath that ended badly in the hopes that like some Western country would like save them, basically. And it didn't work. And basically, long story short,
So the Dashnaks, right? The Armenian insurrectionaries, right? They knew that all this would end, because Armenians used to be the model minority of the Ottoman Empire until the late 19th century. And the Dashnaks, they knew that this would end in massive bloodshed. But as you say, they had the general idea that if we get oppressed too hard, the international community is going to intervene on our behalf. Except that the international community really needs a coastline, or needed back then. This was before B-2 bombers and so forth, and so they needed a coastline to really intervene. And Armenia is a landlocked country surrounded by mountains and Turks and Kurds. And
that's where the that's where that quote came from, like with the reform, where it's like, you people, like, this country is a bowl of soup and everyone's goal is to eat it. This is like what some pasha, like, it might have been apocryphal, but he's like, basically, this country is a bowl of soup and everyone wants to eat it, and we eat it with a spoon, because that's how you eat soup. But you people, like the reformers, the missionary types, you drill holes in the bottom of the bowl and suck it out. And we don't have like straws or gimlets. But what you're doing is basically just very dishonest and like, it's ridiculous and
dishonorable.
I don't know.
The interesting thing is that the people that slaughtered the Armenians during World War I, where they were kind of they were viewed by the Turks as basically an existential threat. They saw lots of Armenians in the Russian army. They saw all this stuff. The people that did all this stuff, that architected this policy, were the progressive Turks, the CUP.
Jamal Pasha,
Talat Pasha, who had Enver Pasha, as I recall. So these guys were the most progressive of the Turks. These guys had really deeply imbibed all these ideas of nationalism and self-determination and so on and so forth. And they said, listen, these Turks, these Armenians are getting in the way of us implementing the Turkish version of all this wonderful progressive stuff. And their allies left them hanging. It was a terrible crime and tragedy, of course. But let's go back to our Arabists, and I think we're about an hour into this almost, or 45 minutes. I wanted to kind of segue into Ike's Gamble, which is the second book, which kind of dovetails into this perfectly. So the background to Ike's Gamble is that as a result of World War II, America has found itself, it's bailed out England, right? Ike's Gamble starts at the beginning of Eisenhower's first term, and America found itself bailing out England during World War II. And England, of course, said, "Hey, this is great. We can really regain we've been slipping, but we can regain this in partnership with America. America is going to just be here for us, bail us out with money and weapons, and we can.
The James Bond analogy. Felix of the CIA was like the guy at the Casino Royale, and the British actually believe this, which is kind of hilarious that they didn't realize what they were dealing with. But
yes, well, I mean, kind of from the beginning, America said, "Okay, you guys are in some trouble, right? You know, you need some destroyers. You got all these bases that you don't really need,
Yep.
so why don't you sign the bases over to us? You know, you can't defend them anyway." And the British were like, "Yeah, whatever you want." So World War II ends. Britain sort of pulls out of India and Pakistan, which was kind of the crown jewel in of the British Empire.
Yeah.
Even though I'm not sure, did you know this? The Indian Navy was headed by a British admiral officially for something like 10 years after independence. I mean,
I believe it. I mean, that's not like a lot of the time. There's weird links like after you leave a country. Like I think De Gaulle did something wild with what was it, West Africa, where
right.
they just I don't know if this is true. He destroyed all the like even in the embassies. They broke the typewriters and stuff. But I don't know. It seems like usually there's like it's like with the U.S. and like the Taliban. You know, there's all that like military machinery there. It's like everyone's kind of like this is weird. You know, like after they left Afghanistan, or they, you know what I mean?
Well, they want to keep their fingers in the pie, and so Britain also lost Palestine, right? Primarily because they wanted, I think, to keep something going like Jordan after after 1948, where the Jordanian army was basically officered by Brits and armed by Britain and more or less did what Britain said. A similar model in
Pasha Gloob.
What's that?
John Pasha Gloob.
Gloob, is that how you pronounce it?
I don't know. It's Glub or Gloob. I don't know.
I've always said Glub.
Gloob
I don't know.
Dutch.
They had a similar arrangement in Oman, which is why they had their little war in Oman. So you have basically these countries which are nominally independent, but actually they're a dependency of Britain. The Jews weren't having any of that. They fought an insurrection against the British starting from shortly before World War II, and the British ended up leaving. It's very funny if you ever read the last speech that the guy that was in charge of Palestinian Mandate, the last speech he gave. Before they left, it said something like, "In view of the total lack of cooperation and the attacks we faced, and so on and so forth." There were two Jewish organizations which consistently fought the British, more or less, which were Etzel and Lehi. I think Lehi had maybe 1,000 members at its peak,
this is the Stern Gang one.
The British called them the Stern Gang. They didn't call themselves the Stern Gang, but yeah, that's Lehi. Lochamei Chirut Israel, the fighters for the freedom of Israel, and Britain pulled out of here, and this was a big geopolitical problem because Israel sits at kind of this linchpin, this point between Africa, Asia, and Europe, and between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, right? And so this was a big problem for the remnants of empire. So they said, okay, look, we still have the Suez Canal, which we dug. We have a king in Egypt whom we put in charge, who does what we want, and we still have all these bases alongside the Suez Canal. We also have Cyprus, so it's okay. We can still work with this, right? And this is the beginning of the 1950s.
Yeah, but the thing that I don't really understand, Churchill is so strange to me because basically the U.S. was obviously making this move, like you said. The British thought they knew they were going to be like a junior partner, but still a partner. But the U.S. was taking over like things like during the North Africa campaign, they were taking over, feeding that region, which was former British Empire. Like they were doing stuff like the guy Habib Bourguiba. of who eventually became the ruler of Tunisia when the French left. Like, this is, but they prevented the French from arresting this guy for like rabble rousing. They're making all the signs. Like FDR didn't hide his just disgust of colonialism. It's like it was totally obvious that this is like what they had was not going to last. Like, I don't know if it's hard for me to get inside his mind and know what he was thinking. Like
he was trying to make the best of a bad hand. You have to remember that at this time, Britain was on food rations, and Britain was not, operationally free to maneuver economically or in any other way. And so their best bet was to, like what was Britain's strategy in the 2 centuries leading up to this? Their strategy was, look, we're a small island nation. We're off the coast of a huge continent. What we have to do is maintain the balance of power. And whoever is winning on the continent and looking like he might unite it, we need to support the other guy in order to keep things dynamic so that we can leverage our position, in our global empire and our navy to basically maintain ourselves. And they really wanted to do that, except that now they were caught between 2 continental empires. And the American one was also a maritime empire, right? Like they had a continent and they had a global maritime empire. So the Brits didn't have a ton of choices. They didn't have a ton of freedom. Maybe, and also ideologically, they'd moved out of the, it's based and cool to run other people's countries and impose our superior values on them for their civilization. They've moved long past that. By the 1930s already, you had Milner's kindergarten guys and people like Lionel, who their idea was that the British Empire needs to be like Jesus and sort of die in order that all the nations of the world can gain eternal life through that. I mean, it sounds mentally
that just
insane.
Sounds like peak imperialism, though. That's like main character syndrome still.
It is peak imperialism. It is main character syndrome. But the point is that when the best and brightest and the people that are running your country, this is the kind of stuff they believe. You're not, what can you do, right?
Yeah. Just as an aside to talk about the kind of briefly the like just Zionism and stuff. And you can disagree with this, but I am I know like you probably have vastly different opinions than I do about this, but a lot of the stuff, like just knowing, I'm not like an expert on Zionism, but a lot of the stuff is like, to me, is very like creepy in the sense of, I was reading, about Ben Gurion and stuff and just the, what is it, the Mapai Party and stuff. But a lot of this stuff, like during this time, it's just basically communism on all sides. Like Britain's moving to communism, like the Mapai Party, all that stuff is just communism. I realize there's Jewish leaders at the time who don't necessarily like this stuff, but America, like FDR, this is all communism too. Like Nasser is communism. It's just to me, in terms of like a governmental level, it's like kind of unseemly just that this is like the only thing on the menu in like one form or another, if that makes sense. Like, I don't know. It's kind of
that was the milieu, right? Like if you were, your options were basically socialism or nationalist socialism, right?
Which is just socialism with like maybe 1 or 2 extra steps.
And well, it's instead of killing the gulags, the kulaks. Instead of killing the kulaks, we got to kill the Jews who, for being kulaks. Great, wonderful.
But still, I mean, there's a thing,
that was the range.
But like, in the, I don't remember if it was in the Orient book, but he just talks about how like some of the older Zionists. So, for instance, the Chaim Weizmann, is that how you say his name?
Yes.
He was very close, obviously, to the British, like the British Empire. You had the Jewish Relief Agency and so forth. But then you had people like David Ben Gurion, who kind of clashed with him. He's like, no, we need to like align ourselves like with America, like the British, like, so there was sort of like a mini, like a feud between them where like he's like America, like Ben Gurion's like, America's the new hotness. The British are no longer like the people that, you know what I mean?
Sure. So Weizmann. So how did Weizmann? What's his origin story? Weizmann was an organic
World
chemist.
War One.
Right.
The
So
acetone.
well, so for people in the audience who may not know, so during World War One, the British had a tremendous need for explosives because of the warfare in Europe, which took a tremendous amount of artillery shells, and the genius British plan for procuring acetone, which you need as a precursor chemical, was that they would buy it from German companies, which is what they did before the war. A big part of the reason of the tensions between Britain and Germany before World War One were that Germany was a chemical powerhouse, and chemicals, right, like industry runs on chemicals, and Germany was sort of taking over what had been traditional British markets, and this was a big problem because Britain was an island nation and it required massive resource imports, which means that it had to sell manufactured goods and chemicals and so on. So it wasn't just chemicals; it was also manufactured goods. Whatever. The point is that before World War One, the way that the British would get acetone was by buying it from German companies, which would make it. Perplexingly, completely unexpectedly, when England entered into a war with Germany, German companies stopped selling them acetone, and this caused a crisis in 1915, which is to say they couldn't produce enough artillery shells, and they might have had to call the whole thing off. Weizmann had come up with a process before the war, which produced acetone using bacterial fermentation, and so they asked him to kind of commercialize this thing and scale it, and he was the guy that was in charge of doing that. So that gave him he was knighted for that, I believe, and that gave him pull with the Brits. There was also at the same time the British were fighting the Turks on three fronts. They fought them in Iraq, they fought them in Gallipoli, in Turkey itself, and they fought them in Egypt and Palestine, right? And they got their asses kicked in two of the three of those. And the reason they did not get their ass kicked here is that there was an intelligence network that was run by the Jews called Nili, which was very small but very effective. And aside from giving the British information on Turkish dispositions, it also gave them information about water sources in the Negev desert, so that they were able to maneuver through the desert and take the Turks by surprise and basically conquer Palestine from the Turks due to this Jewish intelligence network, whose members all paid for their work with their lives, and they died in horrible ways under torture and so on.
And do you think that like Weizmann considered himself like more like, it seems like he considered himself to be like maybe a British citizen before he considered himself to be like a Zionist, whereas with like, I don't know, Ben Gurion or whatever, it's sort of the opposite. Like he considered himself to be. Would you kind of agree with that though?
I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, Ben Gurion, started off before World War One studying Turkish jurisprudence, because the Turks were the people that ran this place. Ben Gurion was in it one way or the other. He was in it for the Jews, at least as he conceived of the Jews, which may be different from the way that I conceived the Jews. But he was primarily in it for the Jews. Weizmann, I think, was also in it for the Jews, but yeah, he was very loyal mentally and emotionally to the British, even at the expense of the Jews. For instance, there was an episode where the Nazis in 1944 sent a guy named Joel Brand,
yes,
right, to the British.
And they detained him.
Well, right, they detained him, and Weizmann knew about this. So the offer was that Eichmann was, he saw the writing on the wall, and he was willing to spare the Jews of Hungary, which was like 1 million people, in exchange for 10,000 trucks and coffee and whatever. And instead of bargaining with this guy and going, well, how about like maybe 50 trucks, and we don't necessarily hang you after the war. These guys detained Joel Brand until all the Jews of Hungary had been exterminated. Well, practically all. And
that's the whole Rudolf Kastner business.
Yes. So Weizmann knew about this and he let it ride. Because he didn't see Britain. He saw Britain the way that Britain had looked in his youth, and the way that Britain looked in his youth was that it was the dominant global empire, militarily and economically and culturally and scientifically, and you just don't piss against the wind. But it turned out not to be true, and so 1950 starts off with Egypt, run by King Farouk, with an insurgency.
Well, the U.S., the guy in charge of the grain distribution, the guy John Macaulay Landis, was friends. It's the same way that like the U.S. will be friends with like some guy for a while, then they find like someone else and they get rid of him. But the U.S. was kind of like playing footsie a little bit with Farouk, and then then Nasser came along and the Arabists liked him even more, so Farouk had to go. But it's always
it's. I think Kissinger said that to be America's enemy is dangerous, but to be its friend is fatal.
Yeah. That's a great quote. Yeah.
Excuse me. So basically, it's not clear when the American relationship with Nasser and the free officers, the Egyptian free officers, started. The Egyptian free officers were basically a clique of progressive guys in the Egyptian army, which was a bit of this banana republic farce of an army under the British, and these guys wanted their own thing. So they thought the Nazis were swell, but then the Nazis encountered some issues in North Africa and never really got into Egypt. And it's not clear, in this book Ike's Gamble, Doran says that it's not clear when Herman Roosevelt, who was the head CIA guy in Egypt during much of the events, when he got to know Nasser, but they were great personal buddies. And he's implying maybe that Roosevelt and Nasser got to be buddies during World War II when Roosevelt was working for the OSS in Station Cairo. It's not clear. But anyway, there's a coup. Nasser, who is Nasser and the free officers.
He's not actually the head at first. He's like, there's a figurehead guy, but Nasser is clearly the brains behind the throne, so to speak.
Right. They take charge of Egypt. Farouk has to go run away. The head guy is Nagui, but very quickly becomes obvious that it's Nasser. And he's pressuring the British to get out of the Suez Canal in general.
Well, there's three things. Like there was Anthony Eden and Churchill, and there was like three plans that were submitted. The first plan was that the British army would just run the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is, of course, vitally important for trade. Everyone uses the Suez Canal. The British obviously want a base there. The Egyptians don't want them there at all. So there was like option one: the British get to stay with their base and just kind of run it. I think option two was that it was like something like the British would have men there, but they would train Egyptians under them. And then option three, I think, was just them having to leave, basically. And of course, we know which option it was. So I'm sort of simplifying it. But and again, Eden, I think, is more moderate than Churchill on this stuff. He eventually becomes very anti-Nasser. But but they think that, again, the U.S. is going to just make this good faith thing. They're like, we fought with you in World War II, and we helped you out. I know you helped us out a lot, but you're siding with this Nasser guy over us. Like, what the hell? Like, I've been married for like 20 years. And you just meet this Trump, like this tart, and now you're just gonna throw it all away.
Yes, well, exactly. So the Americans, while they're being sort of polite and nice to the British, the Americans have been anti-colonialist for a decade at this point, right? And the American idea, right, the American vision is something like this. we support nationalism, but we're going to be, all these countries that are colonies should be run by progressive nationalists, and we're going to be advising them and funding them and helping them, and they'll basically do what we say, but it's not colonialism because, because it's not called that, right?
And we're doing this to fight communism, even though all these nationalist people love communism and they're basically communist, and they will get stuff from the USSR because why wouldn't they? Because we're still going to just be nice to them and, give them a million chances. It's just
it's the civil rights rationale, right? Like we need to be progressives and implement progressive policies, because otherwise the communists are going to use our lack of progressive policies against us. And so in order to fight communism, we have to become communists.
Just one other thing too that we should kind of mention about this dynamic, because you mentioned Israel and stuff, but this is important and it ties in with the Arabists. It's like the United States has kind of a strange view. So Truman was sort of for Israel. Like, I forget the guy's name. There was a Jewish guy, and he told Truman to talk to Chaim Weissman, and Truman was like, yeah, okay. He had some sympathy for them. Like, a lot of people in Congress also had sympathy for the state of Israel when it was formed. That's one faction, but this, like, Truman would say stuff like, or he'd give his word or whatever, but then the State Department would just sort of negate it. Like, the State Department absolutely had no sympathy for this new country because they're Arabists. They're sympathetic with the Arabs. So that's like a tension that happens in the U.S. Like, a lot of the people, like George Marshall and James Forrestal hate each other, but they didn't like Israel. But so I guess what I'm saying is that when this Nasser thing comes up, you have basically the academic State Department type people who are not supportive of Israel at all. And it's sort of like this weird tension, almost like a civil war within the U.S. government, where
exactly.
I think that's important.
So since you mentioned it, yes, this is a very important aspect of the whole thing, because the permanent government, the State Department, and the CIA, and to some extent the Pentagon, are very much informed by the subject matter experts on the area, who are Arabists. And aside from geopolitical considerations, such as there's a lot of Arabs, they really don't like the Jews, and they have a lot of oil.
Yes.
There's also the personal considerations. Like, again, William Eddy, right? Colonel Eddy grew up was among Lebanese Arabs.
Yes.
The basic way that you think of the Jews in Arab culture is that the Jews, like when you say something like when you have somebody that's sick, something you say to them is like, "May God take your sorrows and put them upon the Jews." That so and also Arabs are very charming and so on and so forth, and so these guys emotionally were very much
This is something Kaplan mentions, and I do want to ask your opinion. Living in Israel, being Jewish, so apparently, like the British, the dilettantes and stuff, the Gertrude Bells, they like the Arabs. But a lot of these diplomats also were charmed by the Arabs' ways. But they did not like the Jews. All right, so basically, there's a book by Paul Fussell, and this is not a digression. How his point is he hates the middle class, but his point is that the upper class and the lower class are very similar in a lot of ways, and they're just who they are. They're not striving as much, whereas the middle class people are just sort of in some ways maybe even more boorish than the poor, in the sense that they don't know the boundaries. But it seems like when these Arabists would talk to Arab leaders and stuff, they'd be charmed by their customs. Whereas when they would interact with Jews, one of them said a quote he's like, these people are just rude. They make it clear when they don't like you, They are arrogant, and they're just as smart as us, and they let us know that. They're when we're trying to do so. I'm wondering if basically the Kaplan describes, and from what I can tell, when they were talking about Sharon and stuff, all the diplomats of course hated him, and Menachem Begin and stuff. They do kind of feel they feel more just dirt under the nails. Let's just get shit done without niceties, for better or for worse, depending on your position. But they're not maybe like some guy like some aristocratic like Charles Crane guy. If that makes sense. Like,
So there's a great quote I believe it's in the Arabists, um,
yeah,
from a British soldier who is in Palestine during the 1930s, and he says, "Look, the Arab, he's a very charming fellow. He might take a shot at you with his rifle when your back is turned, but you can't really begrudge him. Whereas these Jews, they won't shoot at you, but you get this like uncomfortable feeling that they think they're your equals or better than you, and
okay.
that's just unforgivable, right? Um, so
But
America,
it's like with Trump though, in the elites, like how just they don't like him because I think he
yes,
represents that sort of like boorish, like kind of like why are you just making this up? Like why don't you just like shoot straight kind of thing?
right. So Trump is, culturally, he's very similar to a New York City sheepshead bay Jew,
Yeah,
where like a real
he made a
estate
point about
developer.
that. The
Yeah,
sheep's
I
head
had a
people is trying to get their first million.
right, exactly, um, exactly. Those guys. So at the same time in America, you have Jewish newspaper publishers, you have big Jewish voting blocks in key areas like New York City, and so if you're dependent on elections, having these guys against you is a bad thing. So Truman sort of
Yeah,
tried to thread the needle. For instance, the U.S. had an embargo against Israel during 1948, a
they
weapons
got
embargo.
stuff from the Czechs. They got weapons from the Czech Republic or
They
from the
got
Soviet
weapons
Union.
from
Soviet
well,
Union.
it was a bunch of
Czechoslovakia, Soviet Union, same thing.
so Stalin was kind of for the creation of Israel because Britain
Yes.
was against it.
Yeah.
And because they had a bunch of socialist type people, although he
Yeah.
didn't realize that they were not going to be a colony of the Soviet Union. That was the big split between the Mapai and the Mapam. The Mapam were a bunch of commies who split off from the Mapai party, and they had like portraits of Stalin hanging in the dining room of their kibbutzim. But your normal Israeli lefties were very much not in favor of creating a Soviet colony here. Basically, America kind of tried to thread the needle and say, okay, we're not gonna sell arms to anybody, and we're not on anybody's side. Even though they provided economic aid,
Yeah.
they
Of
did not
course.
provide after the state of Israel was established. And we can talk another time about like what the backroom deals were between Reuven Shiloach, who was the first head of Israel intelligence, and like Nelson Rockefeller or whatever. We can talk about that
I think
on
Frank
other
Sinatra
episodes.
also was giving them guns. I know we've gone off in the weeds, and I'm sorry, man.
Frank Sinatra, yeah, right. Yes, there was a whole episode there. So, well, we can talk
I
about
mean,
Meyer Lansky too, who Frank
the
Sinatra was
thing of
not,
it,
doing so in his capacity as a lounge singer. He was a mafia guy, and the mafia
well,
at the time had a huge Jewish component.
there's a
Um,
joke, of course, that Frank Sinatra saved my life. Frank Sinatra would get really mad when you would bring this up, but someone like about his mafia stuff. But someone said Frank Sinatra saved my life. I was on the ground getting kicked and stomped by
and then he
four
stopped.
guys, and Frank Sinatra said, "That's enough, guys."
Right,
But
right.
well, the
So
sort of
wait. Hold on. We're kind of
go
getting
back
into
to
the weeds of this.
NASA.
So let's go back to the early days of the Eisenhower administration. So we have the State Department and CIA, who really don't like Israel. They really do like Nasser, and they're not huge fans of the Brits. Um, you know, and then you have the Brits who are trying to hang on to the Suez with their fingernails. You have Egypt, which is run by Nasser and his three officers, and which is doing a little bit of guerrilla warfare against the British. And then you have the Israelis, obviously, who for them, Egypt, it's the biggest Arab nation, it's the biggest potential threat, um, and so the Americans maneuver on Britain. They say, look, of course we have your back against these Arabs, but you guys got to be reasonable too. La la la. Their view of the Arabs is that their nationalism needs to be encouraged, and that the
Yep.
main problem that the Arabs have, the main problem that the Egyptians have, is actually Israel. And they get the British out of the Suez Canal,
Yep.
um, and it turns out immediately that the main problem that Nasser has is not with the British. The main problem that Nasser has, the main desire that Nasser has, is not to destroy Israel. It's to kind of reunite the entire Arab world under his own rule.
Pan-Arabism.
Right,
Where have we
Pan-Arabism.
heard
But
this idea before? Oh, these missionary schools. That sounds awfully familiar. That's crazy.
correct. And
So this is like, again, it's sort of weird though, because people always point out, and I think that in the sake of fairness, yes, there is like the Jewish law, like there are congressmen who support, like, you know, I think that this should be talked about, but it's also like there's a deeper like part of the U.S. in the Middle East that is not talked about at all, which is that there is like these weird connections that were formed. Like some of this stuff was formed before Zionism was even a thing. Like this is like goes back to the like some of the earliest times in our country, and it's caused a lot of these problems. So like you have the one part of America that's like supporting, you know, the Jews, but then you have the other part that people don't see, these academic people or these people in diplomatic roles or whatever, FSOs, who are just not only are supporting people like Nasser, but they actually like Nasser's ideology comes from them. It didn't like, this isn't an Egyptian thing. This is like a American thing that came here.
yeah, it came from the American University of Cairo, and not from the Quran. The American University of Cairo was, of course, established by 19th century American missionaries. So,
I think it was the last one. I think that was actually founded like in after World War I, but it was the same thing basically. It was promoting the same stuff,
right,
like liberalism,
right, the same ideology. So, from Nasser's perspective, the main problem is that you have these countries like, first of all, you have what's called the Northern Tier, which is America's great strategy was to unite the tier. I mean, it's kind of a misnomer because from the position of the Soviet Union, it was to their south. It was the northernmost countries pushed up against the Soviet Union from the south.
Yes.
Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, right? This was so the idea. You'd have like a Muslim mini NATO, and
like the Baghdad Pact was basically like, we're going to keep the USSR out.
Right. So that was their idea. A lot of these countries were more or less involved with Britain still, and the American idea was to build this sort of mini NATO, and then have the countries immediately butting up against them, like Syria and Jordan, also involved in this, right? And maybe even as far down as Saudi Arabia, to threaten the Soviet Union's southern flank, southwestern flank. So Nasser saw this as the main threat to his plan. Nasser's idea was to play the USSR against the Soviet Union, and then basically to turn Egypt into this global, well, not global, but like at least regional Arab empire.
Yep.
And it's actually, you know, these guys, when you look at how bad their ideology was, it was kind of this mix of like half digested socialism, half digested Nazism, and all this other stuff. And you know, when I read it, I'm like, guys, you know, you got 10 million people. That was the population of Egypt after the war, as I recall. They're living in complete poverty. You have no real industry. Your agriculture sucks. Why don't you focus on that rather than these insane megalomaniac plans that it's not clear what the benefit is? But America is kind of on board with this in a way, right? America is like flirting with him, and America is in the early 50s setting up Egypt's intelligence agency, the Mukhabarat. It's setting up Egypt's propaganda apparatus. You know, the voice of the Arabs.
Yeah, there was a guy, I forget the guy, in the book he talks about that, and I think that you know, the thing is too that's really kind of vile about this, and it sort of goes back to the Kissinger quote, is that the Iraqis, the monarchy, it was still, I guess, technically run by the monarchy at this point, but they had taken, like, they were, you know, pro-American, I guess they were, and Nasser, the FSO, or the society, the free officer, sorry, they were blasting this propaganda into Iraq, telling the people to rise up to kill these people, which eventually happens. Like,
Right.
I do want to talk about the 58 coup at the end of this, but the Nasser stuff was being made by the CIA and being blasted into Iraq in many cases. And like this
Right.
guy is like joking about it, and it's just funny because like you're trying to get Nasser to join the Baghdad Pact, but he's just using the stuff that you give him to like basically just ensure that that pact is destroyed. And the governments that were like loyal to you are going to be, they're going to like be completely screwed. And it's just funny that I don't know, like it's just the typical American like foreign policy deal. If you just read enough about it, it's always a variation of this, just like insane, deranged stuff.
Yes.
Doesn't even
So
make sense from a strategic standpoint.
right. Well, it's like being too smart by half.
Yeah.
So they build Nasser's propaganda apparatus. They have a guy named Paul Linebarger, who's the world's expert, according to the CIA, at bloc propaganda, who was actually a famous science fiction writer. His name was his pen name was Cordwainer Smith. I used to read this guy's stories when I was a kid. He was an excellent science fiction writer.
Okay.
Oh, he's very good. I mean, he was very good at the time. I don't know. Right now, maybe it'll come across as a little bit hokey, but they have this guy in Cairo writing for the Voice of the Arabs. And the way that he describes it later is like he wrote stories which, while they sounded like they were good for the USSR, were actually bad for the USSR. And while it sounded like they were good for America, were actually, or bad for America, were actually good for America. And Nasser, at the same time, he's basically doing what Iran did for the last like 30 years. He's running intelligence operations against the Jordanians and the Syrians.
Yes.
He has special operations running against Israel. He has people raiding, like teams of commandos raiding and killing people, civilians, as far north as like Tel Aviv.
I mean, eventually too, he shuts down the Strait of Tiran, which is sort of how the Israelis got involved with the Suez business in the first place.
Right. But that all comes a little later. But I'm talking about everything that led up to it. And he's got hit teams killing people in like Jordan and Syria, and he's basically using Israel as this kind of wedge issue. Like, look, if you're Arabs and you have pride, then it's intolerable. It should be intolerable to you as the party line that the Israelis exist. And if you look at, the king of Jordan and the Syrians and the Iraqis, these guys aren't actually doing anything against the Israelis. And the Israelis are the main issue facing the Arab world. And you know who's fighting the Israelis? Us, Egypt. So if you want to be a man, you should be supporting us. And this is the party line that Nasser is using against all the other Arab countries, basically. And the Americans are sort of helping him along with it. And the theory is that if you help him with this stuff, then he'll stay on our side. And he'll be against the Soviets, which is the big, the 25-meter target here, or the 300-meter target, depending how big the range is. So Nasser actually plays his game and then screws over the Americans and gets a bunch of weapons from the Soviets, and then gets the Americans, blames the Americans for it. And meanwhile, American diplomats and American intelligence people, like
Hank Byrode is the other guy.
Hank Byrode, right, who's the American ambassador to Egypt, and Kermit Roosevelt, who's yes, he's the CIA representative. These guys are completely covering for him in this, and they're selling all this stuff as. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, just like the lessons of it, and I think he talks about this at the end of the book, how there's this really stupid thing where they're like, it's like this, well, if we had just done more with Nasser and not,
right.
The Aswan high business, whatever, like just been nice to him, he would have been on our side. But it's like none of these people, whether it's like Mugabe or any of these people, like, yes, they will say what you want them to say in certain instances. They'll take your money, but it's like you can't, like, the idea that you're just going to be able to like really control someone like that when because they've already seen that you'll just give them money either way. Like, you're not actually going to stop them if they deviate from your plan. Like, they're just not people that are like, they're not like, what is the term we use? They're not Jeffersonian reformers or whatever. I mean, I guess
right, Jeffersonian Democrats. They're not contract able, right? And Nasser is doing to the Americans this whole time what the Americans did to the British, basically.
Yeah.
Right. In a sense, he's conning them. And the funniest thing about this is that the way that Nasser cons them is through his partners in the American establishment, and the way that these guys do it is they go, listen, Nasser is not a tyrant. Nasser has a cabinet and a party, and there's hardliners and there's softliners. We need to make concessions to Nasser in order that he can keep the hardliners from overthrowing him, and that he has something to bring back to these people and say, look, these Americans are good guys. Look at all the stuff they gave us. Meanwhile, of course, like there's no such thing. Nasser runs this thing with an iron fist, like Stalin. There's no hardliners. There's no softliners. It's all, it's all the same exact thing.
I mean, there's like probably differences of opinion, but that doesn't mean anything under that type of system of government. Like, it's like if you could disagree with like Stalin on whatever, but it's probably not a good idea
to like open your mouth and tell anybody.
Yeah. I mean, it's super weird though, because when you look at this period of time, I think the first book I read on like the whole Nasser thing was the guy Martin Meredith's book on the history of Africa. That's a good book because he kind of does talk about like a lot of the things that Nasser did that really were catastrophically bad for Egypt. But even today, there's like this sort of soft spot for some leaders more so than others. Like, I don't know, like it's like if you speak ill of Nasser, for instance, it's usually there's like a caveat, like, well, it's because of the paranoia of the right wing, who weren't even right wing, people in Eisenhower's government or whatever that just pushed him to do. Like, it's not, you can't just be like, this guy was like a thug basically, and he like royally screwed up the country, and you know what I mean? Like, it's just a weird.
Yes.
There's a lot of stuff in the 20th century that's like that, where you can't just look at this stuff honestly. They always have to add like, well, it's from the legacy of imperialism, where, right. It's like, no, man, like you were given like a Maserati and you wrecked it, basically.
Socioeconomic factors.
Yeah.
So all this stuff culminates basically with the Suez crisis, where Nasser, it's not enough that he got the British out. Oh, wait. Before we mentioned Byrode. So Byrode was an interesting guy. Byrode was a general originally, a brigadier general in the American Army. He spent the war in China and India building airfields for American power projection over the Himalayas, right? And then he moved over to the political side of things. He was on Marshall's mission to China, the fact-finding mission to China, which the result of it, right?
Already, I like this guy. He's got a great resume.
Yes, well, Marshall goes to China, right, and he does a fact-finding mission.
He did a great job there too.
Yes, well, the upshot is that the nationalists need to cooperate more fully with the communists who are going to war against them, and America needs to basically sanction them and pressure them in order to convince them to do this. And that's how you're going to get peace in China, which, of course, the end result of all this stuff is that the communists take over China. And then from doing such a great job, he moves over to the State Department and eventually becomes the ambassador to Egypt. And the funniest part of the whole book is they're having, Byrode lived to a healthy old age. And they quote from an interview with him where, he was basically trying to do the same thing to Israel. We need to sanction Israel in order that Israel makes concessions to the Egyptians, because the main problem in the Middle East is Israel. The main problem is that Israel needs to make concessions, and then we can have peace in the Middle East. All the Arabs, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Syrians, the Saudis, the main problem is that Israel exists. And so they came up with like a plan called Alpha, which originally was that Israel needed to give the Negev Desert to Egypt. That was the British version. Just saying.
Yeah.
But then the Americans kind of softened it up a little bit. They said, you don't need to give all the Negev to Egypt. what you need to do.
There was going to be a little strip. It was like an hourglass, a little strip between the.
Well, you need to give one triangle in the Negev to the Egyptians. You need to give another triangle to the Jordanians. They're going to meet in the middle. There's you'll have a highway overpass, and this thing's going to cut your country in half. But it's okay because you can have your north-south road going under the overpass, and that was their plan. It was called the Alpha Plan. And so Byrode in his memoirs is talking about how he went to Ben Gurion and he said, "Listen, why don't you just, play ball? Why don't you make these concessions? Right now you're sitting behind barbed wire. If you make these concessions, you people are so good with you're so you're so smart, that in 50 years you'll be running all the banks in the Middle East. Doesn't that sound better than sitting here behind barbed wire?" And Ben Gurion just looked at him and said, "No." Like, you people are good with money. Why don't you go run the banks? And, you don't need this whole, army and state thing. So, anyway, what happens is, in the end, the Egyptians take a big arms shipment from the Soviet Union, flex their way over to the Soviet Union while denying that this is what they're doing, and then nationalize the Suez Canal.
To get the revenues for they were gonna at first there was a way to secure funding. They're like, all right, well, we're gonna take the revenues from going through here and we're gonna use that to pay for infrastructure and dams and stuff like that.
Right. Well, but it was also a huge flex.
Yeah.
It was also a huge flex on the in front of the other Arabs. Like, look, we can just take stuff from these Brits and they can't do anything about it. The Brits and the French. And the Brits and the French went to the Israelis and they said, "Look, we're gonna do something about this, and you guys should do something about it too."
And Ben Gurion actually, their plan, the plan was to have Israel go into Egypt, and then they were gonna oh, look, they're fighting, and then the British and French were gonna come in and say okay, we're gonna put a stop. It was completely choreographed, but apparently, Ben Gurion, who again I think you would agree was a pretty devious dude. He's definitely he's I would not. You want to be the last person who talks to him, I guess, if you're in a room, right? But he had them write out their plan and sign it, and he kept copies of it or something. I guess as insurance, but and then he just went back. But the whole incident was funny because it seems like they didn't really want to do that. But he's like, no, we'll just write it down and
it'll be a gentleman's agreement on a handshake. Yeah. And Ben Gurion's like, yeah, gentleman's agreement on a handshake and also a written plan. You guys should sign it and get it notarized too. So the game plan is that the Israelis are going to get tired of Egyptians attacking them, sending Fedayeen to attack them. It was a whole thing that preceded this, which was the raid on Gaza City. Because the Gaza was occupied by the Egyptians, who were using it as a base for guerrilla attacks against Israelis, and basically the straw that broke the camel's back was that their commandos killed a guy bicycling in Rishon LeZion. Rishon LeZion is 20 minutes south of Tel Aviv, so it would be I guess the American equivalent of Prince George County. Anyway, so they raided the Egyptian headquarters in Gaza City, killed a bunch of Egyptian soldiers. It was a big to-do. Anyway, so this was a couple of years before, and then the Americans wanted to sanction them and so on and so forth, brought a lot of pressure to bear. So anyway, the Suez crisis happens a year and a half after this, and the British and the French, as the plan was, are like, whoa, fighting isn't good, violence isn't good. We're just going to go ahead and invade real quick, drop a bunch of paratroopers in. We're going to reoccupy the Suez Canal, and we're just going to chill here until we can, figure out what's going on, right?
Yeah.
So America,
Eisenhower hates it.
Well, America's a little bit schizophrenic here. America's kind of, in retrospect, yeah, we pressured them to get out of there, and we threatened them, and we're going to sanction them, but we were hoping they'd say no.
Yeah, that's what they said. I don't like.
Yeah, that's it's
like
like
they were
John Kerry about Iraq, right? Like he was like, they're like, he was against Iraq, and they said, well, but you were for it. He said, yeah, but that was before I was against it.
Yeah,
like,
and then Eisenhower later. Like I think everyone should read that Robert Welch book on Eisenhower. But Eisenhower is such a strange figure because he is like later on in the book, that the Ike's Gamble book, he says, "Oh, I wish that they'd let them go through with the Suez thing because Nasser was bad." He allegedly said that to I don't know if it was Salzburg. Anyway, the point I'm making is that it's like there's a lot of this in foreign policy also. This sort of, oh well, gee, I don't know if the Khomeini is actually good now. Like, but it's like, who cares? You already did it. Like, it's not like you're going to, oh, who lost China? Like, are you going to give China back? So it's just like, it's like maybe some of these people are reflective after this becomes a burning, like, dumpster fire or something. But it's like that means very little. It's all like, it's just like crocodile tears, basically, right? I mean, it's just like,
yeah. You're trying to
sure that,
recover, whatever you can from the situation in terms of your personal standing.
I'm sure they would have loved if Nasser had worked out, or if any of these people that the U.S. had supported, like Lenin or Mao or whatever, had worked out. And like, but it's like, it never does. So it's just like, okay, well,
it never does, and there are never any consequences for it. Right?
Yeah,
there are never any personal consequences.
So like, his opinions after the fact are almost immaterial to me. Like if he had a moment of reflection or whatever, it's like it doesn't like mean much in my opinion. But
so Britain and France, when Eisenhower picks up the phone and he's like, listen, if you guys don't pull out, you know what I'm going to do to you? And then he like lists all the sanctions and stuff. Yep. And they're like, okay, we're done. Israel took over the entire Sinai Peninsula. Israel now has, as a result of the war, it's sitting on the Suez Canal pretty much. It now has strategic depth versus Egypt for the first time since independence. And Ben Gurion is not having it. Ben Gurion is going, listen, dude, no, we're not going to pull out. Actually, we're going to stay right here. And if you want, you can provide some security guarantees or whatever. We can talk about it, but like he's not really having it. Eventually, and he's trying to use whatever Jewish influence he has in America, meaning Congress and the press, and it doesn't really fly. Eventually, they have to pull back. They have to give the Sinai back to the Egyptians. They have to give Gaza back to the Egyptians. They get some half-assed security guarantees from America, which are like verbal, which in 1967
that's totally valid. A verbal guarantee for like that I swear I'm going to keep my word. I swear it, dude. Don't even worry about
it. Their concern is that Egypt is going to reoccupy the Sinai and then threaten Israel, and also that they're going to close the Suez Canal.
Right.
And Eisenhower gives him his word or whatever, which is funny because when Egypt does exactly that 11 years later, Johnson is like, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. And somebody goes up to interview Eisenhower, and Eisenhower basically makes a televised speech going, yeah, we did promise these guys. Not that that's worth anything, but whatever. The funny thing is that what this turns into is that Nasser, because history works paradoxically, you would think that what this would turn into is that relations between Israel and America would have taken an even further downturn. But actually what happens is that Nasser and the Soviet Union, they turn this thing into a propaganda victory. They say, oh, you see, we defeated the British, and we defeated the French, and we defeated the Israelis, and nobody can stand in our way, and and use this to create a united Arab Republic between Syria and Egypt, which is basically run by Egypt, of course. And
you don't hear about that very much, but like from everything I've read about it, it was just like a disaster. Like I think it lasted, like, what is it, 3 years, or was it? Did it last?
It was a total disaster, but everything Egypt did was a total disaster.
They're not even like parallel countries. It's sort of like with Bangladesh and Pakistan, how that, like when there was the partition, like you knew that wasn't going to last because it's just like, how could that last?
Well, everything Nasser's Egypt did was a disaster, and they took Soviet money to build the Aswan Dam, which itself
Yep.
was a complete like economical, agriculture, and ecological disaster. Um,
Yeah.
they destroyed the most fertile farmland probably in the world, by destroying the annual Nile flood. But basically, the way that Nasser thanks America for saving him here is by screwing over America and embracing the Soviet Union. And Eisenhower is kind of, for him, it's a little bit like the last straw. He pivots towards Israel. He starts selling weapons to Israel. And so the last couple of years of the Eisenhower administration after 1956 are much friendlier to Israel. Of course, this is after 6 years of screwing over everybody in the Middle East, except for Nasser and the Soviet Union. And that's based, yeah.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. I just want to add something about the like a sort of kind of like an epilogue to the Nasser thing with Iraq.
Uh-huh.
So Iraq was, of course, in the Baghdad Pact, and a big part of getting Nasser in was to, get him in this anti-Soviet thing. But of course, what happened is eventually, so there was a guy. The way that I've heard the story. What's that? No. The way that the story is told, I was reading this book on it. It was funny. Like, there was a guy who was King Faisal, his name Prince Ghazi, and he became the leader of Iraq, and he was like this Prince Ghazi with an H.
Prince Ghazi.
Anyway, he wanted to make Kuwait part of Iraq. This is in the 30s, and the British really didn't like this, so he dies suspiciously. Okay, he's also, I think he was a homo. Like, it's just none of these people seem particularly like a lot of these people in Iraqi history don't seem particularly like adept, I guess. But he was like kind of incompetent, but he was a hero because he wanted to make Kuwait part of Iraq. So this like playboy, like poof guy, he dies in a car crash that many people think was done by his cousin Abdul al-Ayla, who was also another homo, and was also like, I don't know, he was more of a puppet, I think, for the British, but he ends up ruling Iraq. He's hated by the Iraqis. He's the regent, and then you have so people in Iraq are angry at this guy Abdul al-Ayla because they believe that he killed Prince Ghazi, and so it's like the revolt against him. But this is a festering wound. People are like invoking Ghazi as a symbol and stuff. And then in 1958, as a result of all this Nasserism and stuff, you eventually do have like a free officer style coup that happens in Iraq, and it kills Abdul al-Ayla, but it also kills like Prince Ghazi's son. So there's like this component of like, oh, revenge against the British or whatever, but they end up just killing the guy's like son of the royal family. And then they put in, you have two like factions basically. You have the pro-Nasser faction, which that went like Saddam was supportive of that. He wasn't anywhere near power yet. But then you have the other guy, like Abdul Qasim, who's like just, I guess, an outright communist, and there's his faction. So the reason I'm saying this is because I think Iraqi history is really funny during this time because of just how ridiculous their government was. But in addition to that, it's just funny that the whole point of this stupid thing with Nasser was to like try to get him into this pact, but really all this like radio propaganda and like just everything just ended up destabilizing someone who was already like an American ally and putting in like just basically a communist government, which is of course like also what we've talked about.
Well, if you think about it, they were kind of like Jeffersonian Democrats.
Yeah, I mean, the thing though that you have to like reckon with though is like this idea is just like, this is not even that much of a 20th century anomaly. Like, these ideas are just unfortunately just deep in like our psyche. Like, I have trouble like squaring a circle with this because it's like you can see all the stuff that was like amazing that America was done like domestically, but then you just see the stuff they're doing abroad, and it's just like this, like it's like HIV, man. It's like they're just promoting like these harebrained little schemes that have no even purpose beyond just like, oh well, I like this guy. You know what I mean? Like it's insane.
Well, from the perspective of the guys that were on the ground, they were having a great time, and also I guess from the perspective of the guys that were pulling the strings, like the Dulles brothers, who were running CIA and state throughout this whole period. I'm sure they were having a great time playing Empire. The people that mostly suffered from them were, I mean, the guys on the ground, the in Egypt, who had to deal with, I mean, how many years of dysfunctional government? You can say like Hosni Mubarak from the 80s onwards was, he was bad, but at least things were sort of stable.
They called him the infrastructure president, I believe, like because he just built bridges and stuff. That was his nickname, the infrastructure president. He had no charisma, but he was like known for building infrastructure.
I mean, there's worse things that you can be known for, right?
Absolutely.
There's far worse things. And from the Iraqi perspective, obviously all this was not fun either. When I was over there, we had a couple of Iraqis that I was sitting there talking to, and they said, we haven't for the last 100 years, gone 10 years without a big war. And I tried to ask them, what about the 1910s? What about the 1920s? It turned out they were basically right.
So the 80s were a good year. That was a pretty peaceful year for Iraq. The 80s, nice and chill.
The 80s were nice. Yeah, that's true. That's true. So let's kind of summarize this whole thing up from what I understand. So there was a professional class of Arab experts in America who ran American policy with regards to the Middle East in large part, or had a very outsized influence for many decades. They had a certain ideology which led them to react to incentives kind of paradoxically, meaning that if somebody was interested in being America's friend, it actually incentivized them to mistreat those people and use all the leverage at their disposal to get them to make suicidal concessions to their enemies. All this, of course, would backfire, and so it wouldn't reach its logical conclusion. In large part because their clients like Nasser would overreach, right? But it was not due to lack of trying. That's what I got from these two books. I think our next conversation will be about John Brown and the people behind them, the Secret Six, and the people and the ideology behind the Secret Six, which was 19th century New England Yankeeism, basically.
Very similar to the Pan.
Dovetails perfectly. Dovetails perfectly. We just don't have the time to get all that on one episode, but it dovetails perfectly. What else have we learned from all this mess?
Go on to the Abdul Al-Ila Wikipedia page, ILAH. It's pretty funny. Like, no, not you, like the people listed, because like I'm telling you, Iraqi history is really funny. That's like a side note, but
yes.
But yeah, basically, Middle East government seems to be not very good on the best day, or I guess when you add outside elements, it really seems to go downhill. I guess is what, like the places like the Ottoman Empire. I guess I don't have romantic illusions about it, but it doesn't seem like the current government is also doing particularly well. Like the governments in that region are doing particularly well either. I don't know. I was the U.S. didn't do him any favors.
Well, I was struck by the parallels between the way that the American apparatus related to Nasser, and that the way that the American apparatus related to Iran 50 years later. Because Iran was doing very much similar things to Nasser's Egypt, right? And the Americans related to them in a very similar way, which was, like the Obama administration, like the way that you treat Iran was that you needed to give them more money, you needed to give them more concessions, and even if they, anything they'd say about Americans, death to America, was all like hand waved away as just rhetoric.
Yeah.
That's just the way they express themselves. When they captured American servicemen and like publicly humiliated them, that
Well,
was like no big
there was
deal.
the thing where Sadiq Kalkali, they called him, I think, the cat, because when he was imprisoned by the Shah, he would like strangle cats in his jail cell. But
What a nice, sweet.
he was in Khomeini's government, and he was like, I think, in charge of the security stuff. He was going around putting down Turkmen revolts, hanging drug dealers, whatever. But when there was was it Eagle Claw, when the helicopters crashed, he held up a charred hand of a U.S. serviceman, I believe. I think that was him, and that's like an infamous story. But that was like what our new like experiment. Because if you go onto the Khomeini Wikipedia page, I'm amazed more people don't talk about this. There is a section on there, and I've done like some more reading. Apparently, the cables are declassified. That yes, like the U.S. State Department, like surprise, surprise, was absolutely involved in bringing him to power. Carter had a weird relationship with the Shah, but if you read books on the Iranian Revolution, they don't really talk about this, even though this is the most important part of the story, in my opinion. But they absolutely were involved in helping him get to power. There's a thing too, like Khomeini, like Nasser was sort of laughing at them. He's like, "Ha, you idiots trusted me," type thing. Like I'm not a. It's just the same story, man. It's almost like it's like destiny or something. I don't know. That sounds corny, but it just seems like destiny is like the right word to describe this foreign policy, because it just repeats so often. And I don't know.
If you
I don't really know
keep
what to
doing the
make
same
of it.
thing, you might be getting the same results. It might not be a
Yeah.
coincidence. It's interesting that it's interesting. Like, well, the question is, um, how should one position himself with regards to America? If you have a country in the Middle East, how should you relate to America? If you let America be your best friend, you're going to be dead very quickly. If you make America your worst enemy, also not good. How do
There's
you?
no good. I mean, well, like we're not the first to bring this up, but I mean, like the Mubarak regime, the military and stuff. That was a previous, that was like basically just kind of a continuation of Nasserism. But the U.S. found something better. They eventually, like, even when they made peace with the U.S., though, that was a previous like U.S. aided client who came to power, and the U.S. got rid of them. The U.S. found someone else, like when they got rid of Mubarak. So it's like if you go long enough with like just the United States, eventually, even if you were like their progressive darling or whatever, they will just replace you with someone else. It's really insane. It's like I don't know.
It's like watching a Scorsese mafia movie where
Yeah,
there's not going to be a good ending for any of these people, probably. Um,
well, like
what's
for what was it? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say that all of this is very interesting from an Israeli perspective, of course. It makes me also think that it may be that in 10 years you'll find that America has the State Department, has people up there explain to the president that you got to give the Hilltop Youth money so that the moderate Hilltop Youth you know have a card to play against the extremist Hilltop Youth, and so on and so forth. And so that like it could all in theory go the other way, especially because the people who the sociocultural class people that were the substrate for all this, right? Dulles and all these guys, they kind of failed to reproduce. You still have some of these Yankees in the American government, but more or less because they failed to reproduce. You now have people who were the students of those Yankee students at Georgetown or whatever, and so I think that this script might be coming to an end just because of population replacement factors.
Well, the thing that's kind of interesting is that I was like thinking about this is that if you look at the creation of Israel, it is surrounded by a lot of so we talked about the fall of China and stuff, but basically um, that was also, you know, you had elements in the U.S. government that were sort of supportive of the nationalists. They did not have nearly as much power as the State Department people, but the State Department people prevailed. You had Mao, and you have like Batista, and you have, you know, we talked about that in the first episode. But again, you have people that are supportive of him. Even like you had the guy in the State Department that was supportive of him. They got rid of him. The New York Times started to publish stuff, pro-Castro stuff. You had an arms embargo, but so eventually Castro prevailed. If the U.S. had not been involved, these conflicts would not have gone this way. I mean, you could make the case that the USSR and Mao, but the U.S. was giving money to the USSR too. So it's like, anyway. But the point I'm making is that with Israel, you kind of have, if you were to look at that formula, you would sort of think that it wouldn't have worked just based on the fact that the State Department and like academia rarely seemed to lose, but it actually did end up kind of being the exception to it in 48. And that's kind of interesting. I guess I don't know if that's just because of, like you said, the amount of like just Jewish people that did live in America and had like, you know, support for it, or what do you think? Like, why do you think Israel sort of bucked that trend? Because you would agree that usually when the State Department doesn't want something, that thing goes away or gets like goes through the mill, basically.
I think it's because of many different things, socioeconomic factors, right? I think I think that in America there were many Jews who, while they'd stepped away from Judaism and become more or less assimilated, they still had some sort of sentimental attachment to Israel. And you know, whereas for instance, Rhodesia didn't have a big Rhodesian diaspora in
Yes.
right? There weren't a lot of like Rhodesian scientists working for the Department of Defense. You know, there weren't. You know, you mentioned Carter. So the funny thing about Carter was that Carter had been a nuclear submarine officer.
Yeah.
The guy that built the American nuclear fleet was Admiral Hyman Rickover, who had been born in Poland. His name was Hyman G. Rickover, and the G stood for Gdale. He was a Polish Jew. Came to America at a very young age, did the Naval Academy, was a naval engineer, and built the American nuclear fleet. Which just for a point of comparison, there's never been an uncontrolled release of radiation from an American Navy nuclear reactor. There's never been a significant nuclear accident because he engineered it that way, because he built it that way, because he built the staff and the procedures that way. You know, for a point of comparison, Russia's had like 14 nuclear reactor meltdowns. The Russian Navy, right? So it's not just something that happens.
K-19. What was that movie with the Harrison Ford?
Yeah, but there were a bunch of other ones too, and you know the Kursk sank, and you know it's not because the Russian nuclear navy is engineered by a bunch of guys that are like get distracted because they gotta, you know, they're eating their boogers, you know. So that's an example, right? So Rickover personally interviewed every single nuke, as I recall, every like reactor operator, whatever. He was the longest serving officer in the history of the U.S. Navy. He was an officer in the Navy for 63 years, right? And he would personally interview them, and he was emotionally very, very harsh. He was very, very abusive. People were traumatized by these interviews with him for their entire lives. You know, ironically, he was ironically known as the KOG, the kindly old gentleman, because he was such an asshole. You know, he would do things. He would do things like he had an interview chair, which the front legs were shorter than the back legs, and you'd be sitting there in this like interrogation device as he was interrogating you. And if you didn't like your answers, he'd tell you, "Okay, go sit in that mop closet and think," and he'd leave you in there for like a couple hours. You know, he would do this to like U.S. Navy Academy midshipmen. He would do this to more senior officers that were transferring over to the nuclear fleet. And you know, I mean, people hated him. It took congressional influence to get him promoted to admiral, because there were so many people that you know that hated him. Carter wrote in his book about like what an experience it was to be interviewed by this guy. And so I don't know, maybe Carter had some maybe Carter's policy with regards to Israel had something to do with that. I don't know. The point is that Rickover, even though he was exceptional, there were guys like Rickover in the Manhattan Project. There were guys like Rickover who stood up the American signals intelligence global enterprise, like William Friedman. There were the guy that stood up U.S. Marine Corps amphibious doctrine in World War II, and also its helicopter assault doctrine after World War II was a guy named Victor Krulak, who was also a Jew. And so these guys were not religious, but they were also not real shitlibs. And so they served as a real counterforce. The Rhodesians didn't have that.
You might say it's sort of like I think you've used this term, like it's used a lot, but like, would you say it's kind of like an unprincipled exception then, in terms of like, in the idea of like, okay, we are supporting this country for historical reasons, like libs today hate it or whatever, Hassan Piker hates it, but it's like a situation where there is enough inertia to where
it's not an unprincipled exception per se, because Rickover was not a shit lib. And right. Victor Krulak was not a shit lib, and most of these guys were not shit libs, and so they were ideologically Americanists. They really firmly believed that America was the greatest country in the world. And
but isn't that kind of an inherently liberal opinion if you look at like the culture of like the stuff that America exports ideologically? I mean, like,
sure.
Nasser is also like that's Americanism created like Nasser, for instance.
Sure, but Americanism also created John Milius, and Americanism also created like Red Dawn, and Americanism also created, the idea that people have inalienable rights and blah 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 blah. The point is that even though from our 2026 perspective it may seem a little bit cringe and hokey, but these people believed in the American way of life as exemplified not by Greenwich Village, and Lou Reed, slamming heroin and dating transvestites or whatever, but as exemplified by American suburbia in the 1960s, 1950s. So when they looked at the Middle East objectively, I mean, Israel, for all its flaws, and also for its flaws, for things that are flaws from their perspective, but from my perspective are not flaws. Like, I don't think Admiral Rickover was a huge fan of the idea that we're going to rebuild the Third Temple and kind of lead all the nations of the earth in worshiping the one true God. He'd converted to Episcopalianism for career reasons. I can't think of any non-career reasons to convert to Episcopalianism, right? But for all of that, Israel looks a lot more like what they saw as the American way of life than Iraq or Egypt.
Well, that's what's sort of weird, is that inherently, like the Arabists, I think they were just drawn to the fact that it wasn't like what they knew in America. Like it's sort of, that's the exotic appeal. That's like certainly what drew like Lawrence of Arabia and stuff to it.
Yes.
The fact that it's alien.
I think so. Yes, the fact that it's alien, the fact that it's an opportunity to turn your misfit self into a hero. Like nobody gets these people like I get these people, and they love me and they'll follow me anywhere. Meanwhile, who the hell are you? You're some weird, misfit pederast with uncertain parentage. I mean, Lawrence of Arabia specifically was. Sure, but if you're talking about like establishment American Jewish support for Israel in the 20th century, I don't think it was really an unprincipled exception. I think it was. I think their entire ideology was a little bit of an unprincipled exception, because there's a contradiction in terms between being maybe a good Jew and a good American in some senses, right? If you think about like what Judaism means and what like Americanism means, and you really want to follow out the implications, they contradict. But as far as these guys were who they were, which were Jewish Americans working for the Department of Defense, I don't think their support of Israel was an exception to their
I guess you
general
have to
life
really
principles.
think about the thing that's kind of weird about supporting and not supporting, and this is something. There's like running water in the background. I do apologize
Sure,
for
sure.
that. You
No,
can
no,
still
okay.
hear it,
I can't hear it. Yeah.
but it's not drowning out my my
No,
voice
no.
or anything. Is it? Okay, but because we've talked about this too, like the idea of like, okay, the U.S. gives, like, this is support. If you give someone weapons, it's support, but it's also like, it, and this is not just true for Israel. This is true probably for like places like Taiwan and stuff as well, like, or Vietnam and the Vietnam War, like South Vietnam rather. Like, yes, there is a faction of America that is quote unquote like supporting it, propping up the government, um, or giving arms to it, whatever. But that's not free. Like the arms, okay, we're going to give you old arms. Don't build a defense industry, or we're going to do like, there's sort of this weird thing where it's hard to have, I think, a relationship where one country is like more powerful than the other and not just have it turn into something that's probably not good for like maybe even all parties, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, patronage always comes at big costs to all sides, and especially you have this patronage doesn't just happen by emails back and forth, right? You have
Yeah,
people on the ground. These people have their own,
relationships.
yes, relationships. They have their own agendas. They have their own ideologies, and there's always a cost. It's probably not sustainable to be either a client state or a buffer state in the long term.
I mean, well, you've talked about this too, like for like for I don't obviously know very much about contemporary Israeli society, but you've talked about how the elites in Israel, like, um, how are they are basically just American style libs. They are embarrassed at the stuff that, like, what they consider the rubes in their country are doing. They want to be able to. I think the example is they want to be able to shop at Harrods. They do not want to be like Rhodesia'd out. They want to just have, like, the rainbow flags or whatever. And it's the same, like, that mentality is obviously um, like not the same as the kind of people in your social circle, but they basically view themselves as being very similar to like the American elites. And that's
that's
obviously
true.
coming from um, like America. So that's also in a way what, I don't know, just having relationships with, like, I guess the global empire means.
Sure. And if you look at, for instance, Osama bin Laden, the bin Laden family was very much into the sheikh lifestyle, which means that you go to Europe and
Yeah,
you
yeah,
engage in conspicuous consumption of
yeah.
European goods and the European lifestyle, with all that involves. Um, yeah, it's not a great arrangement. I'm not like I don't think it's sustainable in the long term, but fortunately, it seems to be changing in fundamental ways and maybe going away. Um,
You think as America gets browner, like basically you think that this is just not going to be a thing that is like tolerated in America? Like, it's so much as they're like, why are we giving aid to, you know what I mean?
I think that first of all, Bibi has announced that um, Israel is going to be weaned off American foreign aid.
Do you
So
believe
that's
that?
yes,
Okay.
yes, absolutely, because it's to our benefit massively. If we rely on America for artillery rounds, for instance, then that has one big drawback, which is that America can veto our wars
Of
down
course.
to right, and that's what happened with this last war. We had a deal that America stops ammunition here, and we have access to that ammunition. Well, when it came down to it, America used that ammunition as leverage and kept us from Operation Freedom of Maneuver in Gaza, um, to the point that American generals were hanging out inside the Kiryat, the general staff here, and had more or less veto power over stuff going on the ground. Um, and so
Well,
that's one major drawback. Uh, the other major drawback is that American ammunition factories although Anduril, I guess, and people like that are working on this, are operating using 1960s, 1970s technology and standards, and very old staff, right? And so their capacity is limited. Whereas if you build all this stuff, you can automate it. You can use modern technology. You can use AI for manufacturing. You can also, more importantly than that, maybe you can sell it all overseas. You can keep 30%. You can sell 70% to other countries that need it. Ironically, we've been talking about Egypt. Egypt produces artillery rounds in 152 millimeter, which is the Warsaw Pact, the Russian caliber, and also 155, which is the NATO caliber. And throughout the war in the Ukraine, Egypt has been able to sell both to Russia and to the Ukraine and do this openly and
Really?
and not be pressured. And so
That's
not only
crazy.
have they made a massive profit off this financially, but they made a massive profit off it politically too, because people are afraid to pressure it too much, because like Egypt can go, okay, well, in that case, we just won't sell to the Ukrainians, which is your side, right? So good luck. You can't ramp up production. So yes, I think that American military aid is going to go away. I think that's going to be a massive benefit to Israel, economically and also politically. I don't
What do
think
you think is going to happen? Do you think the U.S. will just like, if let's say that happens? I mean, do you think that the U.S. will just like leave you alone, or do you think this will become like a Rhodesia situation, or what? I mean,
well, it can't become a Rhodesia situation in terms of petro. What killed Rhodesia was that South
the
Africa.
oil embargo. Yeah.
Yes. Well, we don't have oil, but we do have massive natural gas resources offshore.
Yeah.
Also, we have access to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, and we have India, which is, regardless of what people may say, it's
Hi,
a
dear.
huge, yes, it's a huge country. It's an economic powerhouse, and it needs our production. So I don't think the Rhodesian scenario is going to happen. Aside from that, Rhodesia's primary production was agricultural,
Right.
which is say like it's easily replaced. Our production is tech, and tech is one of those things where a little bit of brains makes a huge difference. And thank God we have some brains. So we might have problems, but I don't think they're going to be Rhodesia problems.
Okay.
I also, there was a joint, or South Africa problems. There was a joint U.S. Soviet plan to
Yeah.
invade
Who
South
was
Africa,
I think
right?
that was I think that was in a UR thing too. Yes, I've seen that. I mean, that was a plan though. Like that's not. That was a plan for You're talking about the Carnegie one. That was a plan for Israel for a little while too. In '48, the U.S. had some proposal to send in, like under the aegis of the UN, to send in Soviet and American troops. I thought in like around the time of '48 as well, like the lead up to that, when there was like a lot of just sectarian stuff. Like
A peacekeeping force.
It didn't work. Okay, have you heard about this?
I heard something about it. I mean, this is what they did in Iran also.
Yeah.
The
They
Soviets said that
took the North, the British took the South.
Right. That's how Iran spent World War II. I don't think that's really.
The Shah was too pro-German or something. Like the Reza Pahlavi was too. I guess he's leaning a little too close. It's like they don't want a Baghdad Railroad 2.0 type thing. So they're like, yeah, you're gonna go ahead and retire, Bahal.
Yeah, they did that. So I don't think modern day America is really capable of doing something like that. Definitely modern day Russia is not capable of doing something like that in terms of force projection, in terms of political will, in terms of the casualties. So I'm not worried about those scenarios. Also, I think America becoming more brown. Look, I mean, they're not going to get browner than like, than Africa, and we have excellent relations with many African countries, which involve us selling them weapons and other stuff that they can't make themselves. They're not going to get more brown than Jordan, and we've had more or less good under the cover relations with Jordan since immediately after the War of Independence. Okay, we had to, Jordan decided to join in the 6 Day War, and we had to relieve them of the West Bank for their troubles. But
Well, there
other
was
than
a thing
that,
in 1970. There was a thing where the Black September thing, where the Jordan, there was like a civil war almost, but I don't know if Israel actually sent in tanks or whatever, but they were like, do you know what I'm talking about? Like there
yes,
was a thing,
we threatened
the
Syria.
PLO, and yeah,
Well, Syria was going to
Syria
invade
was
to
funding
support
the
the
people who were
Palestinians.
trying to overthrow the regime in Jordan, or the monarchy, I guess.
Yeah, Syria wanted to invade Jordan, and they turned
Yeah.
back because Israel told them that they would put a stop to that. Right. So I think that whether America gets browner or not browner, I mean, you're not going to get browner than Somaliland, right?
Well, I just
Yeah.
mean in terms of like the sort of the Fuentes, like Piker, and I know that's kind of like a misnomer way, because like those guys like are like pretty white looking, but you see what I'm like, the people,
Their audience.
the Groyperism, we'll call it Groyperism.
So I think Royperism has sort of jumped the shark. Part of that may have to do with the fact that you now have the ability to look up Twitter accounts, country of origin. Gosh, this Royper MAGA Patriot is based out of Pakistan. Interesting. He must be an embassy kid, right? Um, yeah, I think that's really jumped the shark. I think that they've really sunk so far into stupidity and infighting, and um, I think like Six Emperor Gory Paris, right? Like they've as a movement they've replayed Richard Spencer's career trajectory in a sense.
But I mean, it is kind of weird though. Like I just, to me, it seems like Twitter has gotten like considerably stupider. Like just and I don't know if that's the filter or whatever, but I see a lot of this type of stuff, very low effort. I don't know. Is this like, but like the Zoomers I talk to don't seem to have particularly like, they don't. It's very superficial how they look at this stuff. So I don't think that, like, if anything, I think it's going to just, you're going to see more of this under like various different hats, like just general kind of third worldist kind of like, I don't know. It's just my.
To loop back to the to Ike's gamble. No matter how, like, the definition of an anti-Semite from the perspective of high-class British society was that it's somebody that hates the Jews more than is like generally acceptable or generally necessary, right? You're not going to get a lot more anti-Semitic than the people running British foreign policy, Evelyn Schuckburg, or however you pronounce his name, and so on. And yet, all of a sudden they turned on a dime and went to the Israelis and said, "Listen, we have this problem in the Suez. Why don't we work together and get this worked out?" So that's kind of how things work on the government level. It doesn't matter what like Hitler Roy for 1488 from Pakistan says on Twitter. It doesn't even matter what AOC says. The conversations that decide things are not had in the public sphere.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, it is just kind of weird too how just the amount of accounts in Southeast Asia in terms of the population. I guess that would really explain a lot of it. Like where there's so many people that have internet there, which is why you see so much of it. But there's also just this kind of weird attitude that you see where at first it was sort of like, all right, we're like, we hating the Jews is now like this right wing or whatever pro-white thing, but then it like kind of did this weird loop-de-loo, and now it's like being a brown person supporting every brown communist thing is now the way to own the Jews, even if the reason that you didn't like the Jews in the first place was and you thought the Jews were in league with the brown people, and then now we got to, like, it's weird. It's sort of this weird, I don't know. Indian Dehati villager peasant logic kind of thing.
Yes. Well, if you looked at, I mean, it's not that far away from what we were talking about, where being a proud Arab, during the period of time that we were discussing, meant that the main problem was Israel. Although and from the perspective of the peasants who made up the population of the majority of the Arab countries, this was very true. Until, of course, if you're a Yemenite, this is all very true until Egypt would invade your country and start slaughtering Yemenites en masse. This was Egypt's Vietnam in the 1960s, was they had this endless bloodbath in Yemen, and so on and so forth. But from the perspective of the people running, like, let's say, Syria or Jordan, while of course you were required to say that the big problem was the Jews and the Zionists and the banks and the Rothschilds, and got to throw them into the sea, you knew that actually your personal big problem was Nasser's intelligence service stirring up a coup against you and having your whole family slaughtered by a bunch of retarded peasants. And I think that in that sense, the more things change, the more they stay the same. The rhetoric of the mob generally doesn't matter. Occasionally, it lines up with the interests of one power faction or another, and you get something like the Farhud, the 1941 pogroms in Iraq, or what happened in Nazi Germany. But in general, the people who have the ability to, that they have resources at their control, and they have the ability to make big decisions, generally they're not so much moved by the rhetoric; they're moved by other considerations.
Yeah, okay, that's fair enough. And I know we kind of just went off and we sort of went down like various rabbit holes, but I think it is interesting hearing your perspective on like the future, of your country. And it seems like the Zoomers I talk to about this stuff in general, I think they have the the opinion of like just basically saying is I don't know, like we'll say like the news or like the academics, I guess. So that's like why I was like asking about it. Like they don't I don't think like this is of particular interest to like people my age and younger than me in terms of just like the history of just Israel or the Middle East, but I think that like from what I can tell, their opinions seem to be kind of left wing. If that makes sense to you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there's a huge left wing shift in the public discourse, and that's understandable. Look, I mean, in the year 2000, the idea that, for instance, that a man could be a lady was something you'd have to be like a serious freak, even by academia standards, to express. And now it's basically the opinion of, I mean, probably 80% of academia, 90% of academia, and so on and so forth. So why would this be any different? I totally agree. But fortunately, again, there's not a straightforward line of transmission between the public discourse and foreign policy.
Yeah.
And also history in general moves in paradoxical ways, where everything gives birth to its opposite and clashes with it, and so on and so forth. And I think that was when you read the Arabists and Ike's Gamble with an eye to that, you can see it expressed in multiple ways. For instance, America's century of foreign policy in the Arab world created the most anti-American Arabs imaginable, right? Or England's policy with regards to the Zionists, which was just basically opposition and funding and arming their enemies, ended with the Suez Crisis. So I think if you want to look towards the future, you cannot think linearly. You need to think dialectically.
Yeah. Okay. Should we wrap this up? Because I know you probably got other stuff to do, and we've been on here for a couple hours. So
Yeah.
that was a great talk. I'd love to come back and talk about the Secret Six or whatever.
Yes, let's wrap this episode up, and then for the next one, we will hopefully review the Secret Six and the story of John Brown. Thank you very much for
By Nixon's screenwriter.
I got the other one. There's two books called The Secret Six. I got apparently not the best one, but we can, the story is the
one
same
by
story.
Renahan?
Yes, and we'll discuss that one.
I've read that one too. Yeah.
Okay, cool, great. Okay, Mr. Dictator's Den, thank you very much for your time. Thank you guys for listening to the Postkahanism Podcast, and to the next time.